bone to pick with Selena because, okay, I understand. I really do. I understand that she can't have the relationships that she's been having with all her friends in the past while she's actively defying the king, right? I get that. I understand that. However, does she have to be so mean to Dorian? Does she have to be so mean to him? And why can she not have a relationship with Dorian, but she can have a relationship with Kale? Because she's all shits and giggles with Kale, but then she literally told Dorian, I want you to leave me alone. That's not the first time I've been told that I look like Mackenzie Ziegler or one of the Ziegler girls. I don't see it, but I was a huge fan of Dance Mom, so I take it as a compliment every time. So thank you. But yeah, I've been told that a couple times. I think she's an 18-year-old girl who has never had to deal with feelings before. Okay, you're right. Okay, you're right. I guess. I forget that she's so young and that she literally is a child, but I feel like she's not because of all the shit that she had to go through. It's your smile that makes you look like her. But yeah, her little line to Dorian when she said, when he was like, do you want me to fight for you? And she said, no, I just want you to leave me alone. It was funny, but like it wasn't funny. I know she's doing it for a reason. My girl is, if it's one thing, she is not cruel. She is not cruel. Anyway, let's get started. Chapter 5. We're doing, literally emotional damage because that shit hurt. We're doing 5 through 9 today. And we'll see if I do more. On a rooftop in a very fashionable and respectable part of Rifthold, Selena crouched in the shadow of a chimney and frowned into the chill wind gusting off the Avery. She checked her pocket watch for the third time. Archer Finn's previous 2 appointments had only been an hour each. He'd been in the house across the street for almost 2. There was nothing interesting about the elegant, green-roofed townhouse, and she hadn't learned anything about who lived there, other than the client's name. Some lady Balanchine. She had used the same trick she'd employed at the other 2 houses to gain that bit of information. She pretended to be a courtier with a package for Lord So-and-so, and when the butler or housekeeper said that this was not Lord So-and-so's house, she'd feigned embarrassment, asked whose house it was, chatted up the servant a bit, and then went on her way. Selena adjusted the position of her legs and rolled her neck. The sun had nearly set, the temperature dropping with each passing minute. Unless she could get into the houses themselves, she wasn't going to learn much else, and given the likelihood that Archer might actually be doing what he was paid to do, she was in no rush to go inside. Better to learn where he went, who he saw, and then take the next step. It had been so long since she'd done something like this in Rifthold. Shh, don't say that. Don't bring it up. Since she'd crouched on the emerald rooftops and learned what she could about her prey. It was different than when the king had sent her off to Belhaven or to some lord's estate. Here, now, in Rifthold, it felt like, no, don't say that. It felt like she'd never left, as if she might look over her shoulder and find Sam Cortland crouching behind her, as if she might return at the end of the night, not to the glass castle, but to the assassin's keep on the other side of the city. Suddenly, Selena sighed, tucking her hands under her arms to keep her fingers warm and agile. It had been over 1.5 years since the night she'd lost her freedom. 1.5 years since she'd lost Sam. And somewhere in this city were the answers to how it all had happened. If she dared to look, she knew she'd find them, and she knew it would destroy her again. Yeah, my straw wasn't up. The front door of the townhouse opened, and Archer swaggered down the steps, right into his waiting carriage. She barely caught a glimpse of his golden brown hair and fine clothes before he was whisked away. Groaning, Selena straightened from her crouch and hurried off the roof. Some harrowing climbing and a few jumps soon had her back on the cobbled streets. She trailed Archer's carriage, slipping in and out of shadows as they made their way across the city, a slow journey thanks to traffic. While she might be in no hurry to seek out the truth behind her own capture and stop saying his fucking name, and Sam's death, and while she was fairly certain the king had to be wrong about Archer, part of her wondered whether whatever truth she uncovered about this rebel movement and the king's plan would destroy her too. And not just destroy her, but also everything she'd grown to care about. Savoring the warmth of the crackling fire, Selena leaned her head against the back of the small couch and dangled her legs over the cushioned arm. The lines on the paper she held before her were beginning to blur, which was no surprise, given that it was well past 11 and she'd been up before dawn. Sprawled on the well-worn red carpet in front of her, Cale's glass pen flickered with firelight as he scanned through documents and signed things and scribbled notes. Giving a little sigh through her nose, Selena lowered the paper in her hands. Unlike her spacious suite, Cale's bedroom was one large chamber, furnished only with a table by the solitary window and the old couch set before the stone fireplace. A few tapestries hung on the gray stone walls. A towering oak armoire stood in one corner, and his four-poster bed was decorated with a rather old and faded crimson duvet. There was a bathing room attached, not as large as her own, but still spacious enough to accommodate its own pool and privy. He had only one small bookcase, filled and neatly arranged, in alphabetical order, if she knew Cale at all, and it probably contained only his most beloved books, unlike Selena's, which housed every title she got her hands on, whether she liked the book or not. Regardless of his unnaturally organized bookshelf, she liked it here. It was cozy. She'd started coming here a few weeks ago, when thoughts of Elena and Kane and the secret passageways made her itch to get out of her own rooms. And even though he'd grumbled about her imposing on his privacy, Cale hadn't turned her away or objected to her frequent after-dinner visits. The scratching of Cale's pen stopped. "Remind me again what you're working on." She flopped onto her back as she waved the paper in the air above her. "Just information about Archer, clients, favored haunts, his daily schedule." Cale's golden brown eyes were molten in the firelight. Why go to so much trouble to track him when you could just shoot him and be done with it? You said he was well guarded, yet it seems like you tracked him easily today. She scowled. Cale was too smart for his own good. "Because if the king actually has a group of people conspiring against him, then I should get as much information about them as I can before I kill Archer. Perhaps following Archer will reveal more conspirators, or at least clues to their whereabouts." It was the truth. And she'd followed Archer's ornate carriage through the streets of the capital today for that very reason. But in the hours she'd spent trailing him, he'd gone only to a few appointments right before returning to his townhouse. "Right," Cale said. "So you're just memorizing that information now? If you're suggesting that I have no reason to be here and should leave, then tell me to go. I'm just trying to figure out what's so boring that you dozed off 10 minutes ago." She propped herself on her elbows. "I did not." His brows rose. "I heard you snoring." "You're a liar, Cale Westfall." She threw her paper at him and plopped back on the couch. "I only closed my eyes for a minute." He shook his head again and went back to work. Selena blushed. "I didn't really snore, did I?" His face was utterly serious as he said, "Like a bear." She thumped a fist on the couch cushion. He grinned. She huffed, then draped her arm off the sofa, picking at the thread of the ancient rug as she stared up at the stone ceiling. "Tell me why you hate Roland." Cale looked up. "I never said I hated him." She just waited. Cale sighed. "I think it's fairly easy for you to see why I hate him. But was there an incident?" "There were many incidents, and I don't particularly feel like talking about any of them." She swung her legs off the arm of the couch and sat up straight. "Testy, aren't you?" She picked up another one of her documents, a map of the city that she marked up with the locations of Archer's clients. Most of them seemed to be in the posh district where the majority of Rifthold's elite lived. Archer's own townhouse was in that neighborhood, tucked into a quiet, respectable side street. She traced a nail along it, but paused when her eyes fell upon a street just a few blocks over. She knew that street, and knew the house that sat on its corner. I don't want to read this anymore. I don't want to revisit these memories. I don't want to revisit. I know exactly what she's talking about. Whenever she ventured into Rifthold, she took care to never pass too close. Yeah, I know exactly what fucking house she's talking about. never passed too close to it. Today had been no different. She'd even gone a few blocks out of her way to avoid walking by. Not daring to look at Cale, she asked, "Do you know who Rourke Farron is?" I don't know how you say that name. Rourke? Rourke? It just sounds like a mouthful. Farron. Y'all know who he is. The name made her sick with long suppressed rage and grief, but she managed to say it, because even if she didn't want the entire truth, there were some things she did need to know about her capture, still needed to know, even after all this time. She felt Cale's attention on her. "The crime lord?" She nodded, her eyes still on that street where so many things had gone so horribly wrong. "Have you ever dealt with him?" "No," Cale said, "but that..." Huh? No. 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 Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh. This goes against every single fantasy I've ever had. Oh my God. Oh my, I'm angry. I'm angry. Oh, I'm so angry. Oh my. That's because Farron is dead. She lowered the paper. Farron's dead? 9 months ago, he and his 3 top men were all found murdered by... Cale chewed on his lip, searching for the name. Wesley. Wesley?! A man named Wesley took them all out. He was... Arobin cocked his head to the side. He was Arobin Hamel's personal guard. Her breath was tight in her chest. "Did you know him?" "I thought I did," she said softly. For the years she'd spent with Arobin, Wesley had been a silent, deadly presence, a man who had barely tolerated her, and had always made it clear that if she ever became a threat to his master, he'd kill her. Oh my God! But on the night that she'd been betrayed and captured, Wesley had tried to stop her. She thought that it was because Arobin had ordered her locked in her rooms, that it had been a way to keep her from seeking retribution for Sam's death at Farron's hands, but... "What happened to Wesley?" she asked. "Did Farron's men catch him?" Cale ran a hand through his hair, glancing down at the rug. "No. We found Wesley a day later. I figured he wasn't alive. Courtesy of Arobin Hamel." She felt the blood drain from her face, but dared to ask, "How?" Cale studied her closely. Wait, oh y'all, this is opening up old wounds. I'm gonna cry. If I cry, I don't want judgment. Cale studied her closely, warily. Wesley's body was impaled on the iron fence outside of Rourke's house. There was enough blood to suggest that Wesley was alive when they did it. They never confessed, but we got the sense that the servants in the household had also been instructed to let him stay there until he died. We thought it was an attempt to balance the blood feud, so that when the next crime lord ascended, they wouldn't view Arobin and his assassins as enemies. She stared at the carpet again. The night she'd broken out of the assassin's keep to hunt down Farron, Wesley had tried to stop her. He'd tried to tell her it was a trap. Selena shut down the thought before it reached its conclusion. That was a truth she'd have to take out and examine at another time. When she was alone. When she didn't have Archer and the rebel movement and all the nonsense to worry about. When she could try to understand why Arobin Hamel might have betrayed her, and what she was going to do with that horrible knowledge, how much she'd make him suffer and bleed for it. After a few moments of silence, Cale asked, "We never learned why Wesley went after Rourke Farron, though. Wesley was just a personal bodyguard. What did he have against Farron?" Her eyes were burning, and she looked to the window, where the night sky was bathed in moonlight. It was an act of revenge. She could still... God damn damn it. She could still see Sam's twisted corpse lying on that table in the room beneath the assassin's keep. Still see Farron crouched in front of her, his hands roaming over her paralyzed body. She swallowed down the tightness in her throat. Farron captured, tortured, and then murdered one of my companions. And then the next night I went out to repay the favor. It didn't end so well for me. A log shifted in the fire, breaking open and filling the room with a flash of light. That was the night you were captured? Cale asked. But I thought you didn't know who had betrayed you. I still don't. Someone hired me and my companion to kill Farron, but it was all just a trap, and Farron was the bait. Silence. Then, what was his name? She pushed her lips together. Oh, God. This is so painful. This is so painful. She pushed her lips together, shoving away the memory of how he'd looked the last time she'd seen him. Broken on that table. Sam, she got out. His name was Sam. She took an uneven breath. I don't even know where they buried him. I don't even know who I should ask about it, or who I would ask about it. Cale didn't reply, and she didn't know why she bothered talking, but the words just tumbled out. I failed him, she said, in every way that counted. I failed him. I wasn't expecting to cry today. Another long silence, then a sigh. Not in one way, Cale said. I bet he would have wanted you to survive, to live, so you didn't fail him, not in that regard. She had to look away in order to force her eyes to stop burning as she nodded. After a moment, Cale spoke again. Her name was Lithane. Lithane, that's what I'm going with. I'm too emotional to sound out words right now. 3 years ago. She worked for one of the ladies of the court, and Roland somehow found out and thought it would be amusing for me to discover him in bed with her. I know it's nothing like what you went through. She'd never known that he'd been interested in anyone, but why did she do it? Oh. He shrugged, though his face was still bleak with the memory, because Roland is a Havillard, and I'm just the captain of the guard. He even convinced her to go back to Mia with him, though I never learned what became of her. You loved her. I thought I did, and I thought she loved me. He shook his head, as if silently chiding himself. I thought we were done talking about Sam. Did Sam love you? Yes. Oh my God. I say oh my God. Hold on. Oh my God. Hold on. Oh my God. Yes. More than anyone had ever loved her, he'd loved her enough to risk everything. To give up everything. He loved her so much that she still felt the echoes of it, even now. Oh my God! Very much, she breathed. The clock chimed 11:30 and Cale shook his head, the tension falling from him. I'm exhausted. She stood. Somehow having no clue how they'd wound up talking about the people who had meant so much to them. Then I should go. He got to his feet, his eyes bright, I'll walk you back to your room. She lifted her chin. I thought I didn't need to be escorted everywhere now. You don't, he said, walking to the door. But it is something that friends tend to do. Oh my god, shut the fuck up. Would you walk Dorian back to his room? She batted her eyelashes at him, striding through the door as he opened it for her. Or is this a privilege that only your lady friends receive? If I had any lady friends, I'd certainly extend the offer. I'm not sure you qualify as a lady, though. So chivalrous. No wonder those girls find excuses to be in the gardens every morning. He snorted, and they fell silent as they walked through the quiet, dim halls of the castle, making their way back to her rooms on the other side. It was a trek, and often a cold one, since, I don't know why I'm crying again, since many of the halls were lined with windows that didn't keep out the winter chill. When they reached the door to her rooms, he bid her a quick good night and began to walk away. Her fingers were around the brass door handle when she turned to him. For what it's worth, Kale, she said. He faced her, his hands in his pockets. She gave him a slight smile. If she picked Roland over you, that makes her the greatest fool who ever lived. He stared at her for a long moment before he quietly said, "Thank you," and walked back to his room. Selena watched him go, watched those powerful muscles shifting in his back, visible even through his dark tunic, suddenly grateful that this Lithane had long ago left the castle. My god. The midnight hour. Y'all, that was too much. That was too much. We did not need to go through. Okay, so I was mad. Originally, I was mad that Theron was dead because I had this entire scenario built in my mind of Selena finally getting her revenge, right? I mean, that's what we all wanted. That we wanted her to get revenge. But, however, now that I know that Wesley was the one that killed him, I am glad that it was at least not done by someone that didn't know Sam and Selena. So, I'm thankful for that. Also, Wesley deserved a better death than that. Like a quicker death, less painful death than that. So fuck y'all for making my man suffer. Yeah, those are my thoughts. And Sam, of course. The midnight hour chimed through the castle, the off-kilter ringing of the wretched clock tower in the garden echoing through the dark, silent halls. Though Kale had escorted her to her door, 5 minutes of pacing in her bedroom had sent her wandering again, heading for the library. She had mountains of unread books sitting in her rooms, but didn't feel like reading them. She needed something to do. Something to take her mind off her discussion with Kale and the memories she dragged into the open tonight. Selena wrapped her cloak tightly around her, glaring at the fierce winds whipping the snow outside the drafty windows. Hopefully there would be a few hearths lit in the library. If not, she'd grab a book that did interest her, run back to her room and curl up with Fleetfoot in her toasty bed. Selena turned a corner, entering the dark, window-lined hallway, that ran past the towering doors of the library and froze. With the chill tonight, it was no surprise to see someone completely concealed by a black cloak, hood drawn far over their face. But something about the figure standing between the open library doors made some ancient, primal part of her send a warning pulse, so strong that she didn't take another step. The person swiveled its head toward her, pausing as well. Outside the hall windows, snow swirled, pressing against the glass. It was just a person, she told herself, as the figure now turned to face her fully. A person wearing a cloak darker than night, a hood so heavy it concealed every feature on the face inside. It sniffed at her, a huffing animal sound. She didn't dare move. It sniffed again and took a step toward her, the way it moved, like smoke and shadow. A faint warmth bloomed against her chest, then a pulsing blue light. The eye of Elena was glowing. The thing halted, and Selena stopped breathing. It hissed, and then slithered a step back into the shadows beyond the library doors. The tiny blue gem in the center of her amulet glowed brighter, and Selena blinked against the light. When she opened her eyes, the amulet was dark, and the hooded creature was gone. Not a trace, not even a sound of footsteps. Selena didn't go into the library. Oh no. She just walked quickly back to her rooms with as much dignity as she could muster, though she kept telling herself that she'd imagined it all, that it was some hallucination from too many hours awake. Selena couldn't stop hearing the cursed word again and again. Plans. Chapter 6. The person outside the library probably had nothing to do with the king, Selena told herself as she walked, still not sprinting, down the hall to her room. There were plenty of strange people in a castle this large, and even though she rarely saw another soul in the library, perhaps some people just wished to go to the library alone and unidentified. In a court where reading was so out of fashion, perhaps it was merely some courtier trying to hide a passionate love of books from his or her sneering friends. Some animalistic, eerie courtier who had caused her amulet to glow. Selena entered her bedroom just as the lunar eclipse was beginning and groaned. Of course there's an eclipse, she grumbled, turning from the balcony doors and approaching the tapestry along the wall. Even though she didn't want to, even though she'd hoped to never see Elena again, she needed answers. Maybe the dead queen would laugh at her and tell her it was nothing. Gods above, she hoped Elena would say that, because if she didn't... Selena shook her head and glanced at Fleetfoot. Care to join me? The dog, as if sensing what she was about to do, made good show of turning circles on the bed and curling up with a huff. I thought so. In a matter of moments, Selena shoved the large chest of drawers from its spot in front of the tapestry that hid the secret door, grabbed a candle, and began walking down the forgotten stairs to the landing far below. The 3 stone archways greeted her. The one on the far left led to a passage that allowed for spying on the Great Hall. The one in the center led to the sewers and the concealed exit that might someday save her life. And the one on the right, the one that led down to the ancient queen's forgotten tomb. As she walked to the tomb, she didn't dare look at the landing where she'd discovered Cain summoning the Ritterak from another world, even though the debris of the door the creature had shattered still littered the stairs. There were gouges in the stone wall where the Ritterak had come crashing through, chasing her down to the tomb until she just barely reached Damaris, sword of the long-dead King Gavin, in time to slay the monster. Selena glanced at her hand, where a ring of white scars punctured her palm and encircled her thumb. If Nehemiah hadn't found her that night, the poison from the Ritterak's bite would have killed her. At last she reached the door at the bottom of the spiral staircase and found herself staring at the skull-shaped bronze knocker in the center. Perhaps this hadn't been a good idea. Perhaps the answers weren't worth it. She should go back upstairs. Come to think of it, this could only be bad. Elena had seemed satisfied that Selena had obeyed her command to become the king's champion, but if she showed up, then it would seem like she was willing to do another one of Elena's tasks. And the word knew that she had enough on her hands right now. Even if that thing in the hall just now hadn't seemed friendly. The skull knocker seemed to smile at her, its hollow eyes boring into hers. Gods above, she should just leave. But her fingers were somehow reaching for the door handle, as if an invisible hand were guiding her. Aren't you going to knock? Huh? Selena leapt back, a dagger already in her hand and angled to spill blood as she pressed herself into the wall. It was impossible. She had to have imagined it. The skull knocker had spoken. Its mouth had moved up and down. Yes, this was certainly, absolutely, undeniably impossible. Far more unlikely and incomprehensible than anything Elena had ever said or done. Staring at her with gleaming metal eyes, the bronze skull clicked its tongue. It had a tongue. Maybe she'd slipped on the stairs and smacked her head into the stones. That would make more sense than this. An endless, filthy stream of curses began flowing through her head, each more vulgar than the next, as she gaped at the knocker. Don't be so pathetic, the skull huffed, its eyes narrowing. I'm attached to this door. I cannot harm you. But she swallowed hard. Magic! It was impossible. It should be impossible. Magic was gone, vanished from the land 10 years ago, before it had even been outlawed by the king. Everything in this world is magic. Thank you ever so kindly for stating the obvious. She calmed her reeling mind long enough to say, but magic doesn't work anymore. New magic doesn't, but the king cannot erase old spells made with old powers, like the word marks. Those ancient spells still hold, especially ones that imbue life. You're alive? The knocker chuckled. Alive? I'm made of bronze. I do not breathe, nor do I eat or drink, so no, I'm not alive, nor am I dead. for that matter. I simply exist. She stared at the small knocker. It was no larger than her fist. You should apologize, it said. You've no idea how loud and tiresome you've been these past few months, with all your running down here and slaying foul beasties. I kept quiet until I thought you'd witnessed enough strange things that you could accept my existence. But apparently, I am to be disappointed. Hands trembling, she sheathed her dagger and set down her candle. I'm so glad you finally found me worth speaking to. The bronze skull closed its eyes. The skull had eyelids. How had she not noticed it before? Why should I speak to someone who doesn't have the courtesy to greet me, or even to knock? Selena took a calming breath and looked at the door. The stones of the threshold still bore gouges from where the Riderack had passed through. Is she in there? Is who in there? The skull said coyly. Elena, the queen. Of course she is. She's been in there for 1,000 years. The skull's eyes seemed to glow. Don't mock me, or I'll peel you off this door and melt you down. Not even the strongest man in the world could peel me from this door. King Brennan himself put me here to watch over her tomb. You're that old? The skull huffed. How insensitive of you to insult me about my age. Selena crossed her arms. Nonsense. Magic always led to nonsense like this. What's your name? What's your name? Selena Sardathian, she ground out. The skull barked a laugh. Oh, that is too funny. The funniest thing I've heard in centuries. Be quiet. My name is Mort. Rick and Morty, if you must know. She picked up the candle. Can I expect all of our encounters to be this pleasant? She reached for the door handle. Aren't you even going to knock? Are you... After all that? You truly have no manners. She used all of her self-control to avoid banging on this little face as she made 3 unnecessarily loud knocks on the wooden door. Mort smirked as the door silently swung open. Selena Sardathian, he said to himself, and began laughing again. Selena hissed in his direction and kicked the door shut. The tomb was dim with foggy light, and Selena approached the grate through which it poured, carried down by the surface, from the surface by a silver-coated shaft. It was... shaft. It was... Sorry. It was normally brighter in here, but the eclipse made the tomb increasingly murky. She paused not too far from the threshold, set the candle on the floor, and found herself staring at nothing. Elena wasn't there. Hello? Mort chuckled from the other side of the door. Selena rolled her eyes and yanked the door back open. Of course, Elena wouldn't actually be here when she had an important question. Of course, she'd only have something like Mort to talk to. Of course. Is she coming tonight? Selena demanded. No, Mort said simply, as if she should have known already. She nearly burnt herself out helping you these past few months. What, so she's gone? For the time being, until she regains her strength. Selena crossed her arms, taking yet another long, long breath. The chamber seemed the same as it had been the last time she was here. 2 stone sarcophagi lay in the center, one depicting Gavin, Elena's husband, and the first king of Lan, and the other, Elena, both with eerily lifelike quality. Elena's silver hair spilled the side of the coffin, disrupted only by the crown atop her head, and the delicately pointed ears that marked her as half human, half fae. Selena's attention lingered on the words etched at Elena's feet. Ah, time's rift. Brannan, Elena's fae father, not to mention the first king of Terrasen, had carved the words into the sarcophagus himself. The whole tomb was strange, actually. Stars had been carved into the floor, and trees and flowers adorned the arched ceiling. The walls were etched with word marks, the ancient symbols that could be used to access a power that still worked, a power that Nehemiah and her family had long kept secret until Cain had somehow mastered it. If the king ever learned of their power, if he knew it could summon creatures as Cain had done, he could unleash endless evil upon Aurelia. Well, and his plans would become even more deadly. But Elena did tell me that if you deign to come here again, Mort said, she had a message for you. Selena had a feeling of standing in front of a cresting wave, waiting for it to break. It could wait. The message could wait. The oncoming burden could wait for another moment or two, of freedom. She walked to the back of the tomb, which had been piled with jewels and gold and trunks overflowing with treasure. Before it was all displayed, a suit of armor and Damaris, the legendary sword of Gavin. Its hilt was silvery gold and had little ornamentation save for a pommel in the shape of an eye. No jewel lay in the socket. It was only an empty ring of gold. Some legends claimed that when Gavin wielded Damaris, he would see only the truth, and that was why he had been crowned king, or some nonsense like that. Damaris' scabbard was decorated by a few word marks. Everything seemed connected to those blasted symbols. Selena scowled and examined the king's armor. It still bore scratches and indentations upon its golden front. From battles, no doubt. Perhaps even the fight with Erawan, the Dark Lord who had led an army of demons and the dead against the continent when the kingdoms had been little more than warring territories. I'm gonna be honest, y'all, I didn't pay attention to a single thing that I just read. I was in one ear, out the other. Elena had said that she was a warrior too, but her armor was nowhere to be seen. Where had it gone? It was probably lying forgotten in a castle somewhere in the kingdoms. In the kingdoms, yeah. Forgotten. The same way legend had reduced the fierce warrior princess to nothing more than a damsel in a tower, whom Gavin had rescued. "It's not over, is it?" Selena asked Mort at last. "No," Mort said, quieter than he'd been before. This was what Selena had been dreading for weeks, for months. The moonlight in the tomb was fading. Soon the eclipse would be complete and the tomb would be dark, save for the candle. "Let's hear the message," Selena said, sighing. Mort cleared his throat, and then said in a voice that sounded eerily like the Queen's, "If I could leave you in peace, I would. But you have lived your life aware that you will never escape certain burdens. Whether you like it or not, you are bound to the fate of this world. As the King's champion, you are now in a position of power, and you can make a difference in the lives of many." Selena's stomach turned over. "Cain and the Ridrak were just the beginning of the threat to Aurelia," Mort said, the words echoing around the tomb. "There is a far deadlier power poised to devour the world. And I have to find it, I suppose. Yes, there will be clues to lead you, signs you must follow. Refusing to kill the king's target is only the first and smallest step." Selena looked toward the ceiling, as if she could see through the tree-carved surface to the library far, far above. "I saw someone in the castle hallway tonight. Something. It made the amulet glow." "Human?" Mort asked, sounding reluctantly intrigued. "I don't know," Selena admitted. "It didn't feel like it." She closed her eyes, taking a steadying breath. She'd been waiting for this for months. "It's all connected to the king, isn't it? All of these awful events, or all of these awful things. Even Elena's command. That's about finding whatever power he has, the threat he poses. You already know the answer to that." Her heart thundered, with fear, with anger she didn't know. If she's so damn powerful and knows so much, then she can go find the king's source of power herself. It is your fate and your responsibility. "There's no such thing as fate," Selena hissed. "Says the girl who was saved from the Ridrak because some force compelled her down here on Selene to see Damaris and learn it was here." Selena took a step closer to the door. "Says the girl who spent a year in Endivir. Says the girl who knows that the gods care no more for our lives than we care for an insect beneath our feet." She glared into Mort's gleaming face. "Come to think of it, I can't quite recall why I should bother helping Aurelia, when the gods so clearly don't bother to help us either." "You don't mean that," he said. Selena gripped the hilt of her dagger. "I do. So tell Elena to find some other fool to impose upon. You must discover where the king's power comes from and what he plans to do, before it's too late." Selena snorted. "Don't you understand? It's already too late. It's been too late for years now. Where was Elena 10 years ago when there was a whole host of heroes that she could have had her pick of? Where was she in her ridiculous quests when the world truly needed them? When Terrason's heroes were cut down or hunted and executed by Ardalan's armies? Where was she when the kingdoms fell, one by one, to the king?" Her eyes burned, but she shoved the pain down to that dark place where it dwelled inside of her. "The world is already in ruin, and I won't be set on some fool's errand." Mort's eyes narrowed. Inside the tomb, the light had faded. The moon was almost fully covered now. "I'm sorry for what you have lost," he said in a voice that was not quite his. "And I'm sorry about your parents' death that night. It was—" "Don't you ever talk about my parents," Selena snarled, pointing a finger at his face. I don't give a damn if you're magic or if you're Elena's lackey or if you're just some figment of my imagination. You talk about my parents again and I'll hack this door to pieces. Understand? Mort just glowered at her. You're that selfish? That cowardly? Why did you come down here tonight, Selena? To help us all? Or just to help yourself? Elena told me about you. About your past. Shut your rutting face, she snapped, and stormed up the stairs. I mean, you can't blame this girl for not wanting any more fucking drama. Like, that girl needs a break. Chapter 7. Selena awoke before dawn with a pounding headache. It took one look at the mostly melted candle on her nightstand to know that her encounter in the tomb hadn't been some awful dream, which meant that far beneath her room there was a talking door knocker imbued with an ancient animation spell, and that Elena had yet again found a way to make her life infinitely more complicated. Selena groaned and buried her face in her pillow. She'd meant what she'd said last night. The world was beyond helping. Even if she'd seen firsthand just how dangerous things could become, how much worse it could be, and that person in the hall. She flipped onto her back and Fleetfoot poked her cheek with a wet nose. Idly stroking the dog's head, Selena stared up at the ceiling and the pale gray light seeping through the curtains. She didn't want to admit it, but Mort was right. She'd gone to the tomb just to have Elena deal with the creature in the hallway, to be reassured that she wouldn't have to do anything. My plans, the king had said, and if Elena was warning her to uncover them, to find the source of his power, then they had to be bad. Worse than the slaves in Calicula and Endivere, worse than putting down more rebels. She watched the ceiling for another few moments until two things became clear. The first was that if she didn't uncover this thread, it might be a fatal mistake. Elena had just said that she had to find it. She hadn't said anything about destroying it, nothing about facing the king, which was a relief, Selena supposed. And the second was that she needed to speak with Archer, to get closer and start figuring out a way to fake his death. Because if he truly was a part of this movement, that he knew what the king was up to, then perhaps he could save her the trouble of spying on the king and piecing together whatever clues she could find. But once she took that step toward approaching Archer, well, then everything would certainly become a lethal game. So Selena quickly bathed and then dressed in her finest, warmest clothes before calling for Kale. It was time for her to conveniently run into Archer Finn. Thanks to the snow from the night before, some poor souls had been conscripted into shoveling Rifthold's most fashionable districts. Business stayed open year-round, and despite the slick sidewalks and slushy cobblestone streets, the capital city was just as vibrant that afternoon as it was at the height of the summer. Selena wished it were summer, since the wet streets soaked the hem of her ice blue gown, and it was so cold that not even her white fur cloak could keep out the chill. As they walked down the crowded main avenue, she kept close to Kale. He had been pestering her again to let him help with Archer, and inviting him along today was the most harmless thing she could do to get him off her back about it. She'd insisted he wear normal clothes instead of his captain's uniform. To him, that meant showing up in a black tunic. Thankfully, no one paid them much heed, not when there was so many people in so many stores. Oh, how she adored this avenue, where all the fine things in the world were sold and bartered. Jewelers, hatters, clothiers? I don't know, confectionaries, cobblers. Unsurprisingly, Kale stumped right past every shop window, not even glancing at the lights. It's plain inside. As usual, there was a crowd outside the Willows, the tea court where she knew Archer was having his lunch. He seemed to dine here every day with a few other male courtesans. Of course, it had nothing to do with the fact that most of Rifthold's elite patronesses also dined here. She grabbed Kale's arm as they drew near the tea court. "If you walk up looking like you're going to pummel someone," she crooned, linking her elbows through his, "then he'll certainly know something is amiss. And again, do not say anything to him. Leave the talking and the charming to me." Kale raised his brows. "So I'm just here for decoration. Be grateful I consider you a worthy accessory." He grumbled something under his breath that she was fairly certain she would not want to hear, but still slowed her pace to a rather elegant walk. outside the arched stone and glass entrance to the tea court. Fine carriages loitered in the street, people hopping in and out of them. She could have taken a carriage, should have taken a carriage, given how cold it was and the fact of her now sodden gown. But she'd foolishly wanted to walk, to see the city on the arm of the captain of the guard, even if he spent the entire time looking like a threat was lurking around every corner and down every alley. Come to think of it, a carriage probably would have made a better entrance, too. Entry to the Willows required a hard-to-attain membership. Selena had taken her tea there several times while growing up, thanks to Arabin Hamel's name. She could still recall the clink of porcelain, the hushed gossip, the mint and cream painted room, and the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked an exquisite garden. "We're not going in there," Cale said, and it wasn't exactly a question. She gave him a feline grin. "You aren't afraid of a bunch of stuffy old ladies and giggling young women, are you?" He glared at her, and she patted his arm. "Weren't you listening when I explained my plan? We're just going to pretend that we're waiting for our table. So don't fret. You won't have to fight off all the mean little ladies clawing at you. The next time we train," he said as they eased through the throng of beautifully dressed women, "remind me to wallop you." An elderly woman turned to glare at him, and Selena gave her an apologetic and exasperated look as if to say, "Men." She then promptly dug her nails into Cale's thick winter tunic and hissed, "This is the part where you shut your mouth and pretend to be a woolly-headed bit of decoration. Shouldn't be too hard for you." His returning pinch told her that he was really going to make her sweat the next time they were in the training room. She grinned. After finding a spot just below the steps that led up to the double doors, Selena glanced at her pocket watch. Archer had begun dining at 2, and usually the meal was over within 90 minutes, which meant that he'd be leaving any second now. She made a good show of pretending to rummage through her small coin purse, and Cale, mercifully, kept quiet, observing the crowd around them, as if these fancy women might attack them at any moment. A few minutes passed, and her gloved hands grew numb as people continued walking into and out of the tea court, so often that no one bothered to notice that they were the only ones who weren't about to go in. But then the doors opened, and Selena caught a glimpse of bronze hair and a dazzling smile, and she moved. Cale played along with expert skill, escorting her up the steps, up, until, "Oomph!" she cried, slamming into a broad, muscled shoulder. Cale even pulled her to him, a supporting hand on her back to keep her from toppling down the stairs. She looked up through her lashes, and then a blink. 2 blinks. The exquisite face gaping at her broke into a grin. "Lena? Lena?" She planned to smile anyway, but when she heard his old pet name for her, "Archer!" She felt Cale stiffen slightly, but she didn't bother to glance at him. It was hard to look away from Archer, who had been, and still was, the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. Not handsome, beautiful. His skin glowed golden, even in the height of winter, and his green eyes, God's above and words save me. His mouth was a work of art, too, all sensual lines and softness that begged to be explored. As if emerging from a daze, Archer suddenly shook his head. "We should get off the steps," he said, extending a broad hand to gesture to the street below them. "Unless you and your companion have a reservation." "Oh, we're a few minutes early anyway," she said, letting go of Cale's arm to walk back onto the street. Archer followed beside her, giving her a glance at his clothes. Expertly tailored tunic and pants, knee-high boots, a heavy cloak. None of it screamed wealth, but she could tell it was all expensive. Unlike some of the flashier and softer male courtesans, Archer's appeal had always been more ruggedly masculine. The broad, muscled shoulders and powerful frame. Hold on, y'all. Why am I getting hot hearing about this man? The knowing smile. Even his beautiful face radiated a sense of maleness that had her struggling to remember what she'd planned to say. Even Archer seemed to be searching for words as they faced each other on the street, a few steps away from the busy crowd. "It's been a while," she began, smiling again. Cale remained a step away, utterly silent and unsmiling. Archer stuffed his hands into his pockets. "I almost didn't recognize you. You were just a girl when I saw you last. You were 13, I think." She couldn't help herself. She looked up at him from beneath lowered lashes and purred. "Oh, this bitch. I'm not 13 anymore." I can't. Archer gave her a slow, sensual smile as he took her in from head to toe before saying, "It would certainly seem that way." Gross. You filled out a bit more, too, she said, returning the favor of surveying him. Archer grinned. Comes with the profession. He angled his head to the side, then flicked his magnificent eyes to Cale, who now stood with his arms crossed. She still remembered how adept Archer had been at taking in details. It was probably part of the reason he'd become the top male courtesan in Rifthold, and a formidable opponent when Selena was training at the Assassin's Keep. She glanced at Cale, who was too busy staring down Archer to notice her attention. He knows everything, she told Archer. Some tension flowed out of Archer's shoulders, but the surprise and amusement were also wearing off, replaced by hesitant pity. How'd you get out? Archer asked carefully, still not mentioning anything about her profession or Endeavor, despite her reassurance that Cale knew. I was let out. By the king. I work for him now. Archer eyed Cale again, and she took a step toward the courtesan. He's a friend, she said softly. Was it suspicion or fear in his eyes? And was it merely because she worked for a tyrant that the world feared, or because he'd actually turned rebel and had something to hide? She kept herself as casual as possible, as unthreatening and relaxed as anyone might be upon encountering an old friend. Archer asked, Does Arabin know you're back? That was not a question she'd prepared for, or wanted to hear. She shrugged. He has eyes everywhere. I'd be surprised if he didn't know. Archer nodded solemnly. Stop bringing up this dude's name, please. I'm never gonna make it through this fucking book if we keep bringing him up. I'm sorry. I heard about Sam, and about what happened at Farron's house that night. He shook his head, closing his eyes. I'm just sorry. Even though her heart twisted at his words, she nodded. Thank you. She put a hand on Cale's arm, suddenly needing just to touch him, to make sure he was still there, needing to stop thinking about this, too. She sighed and pretended to look interested in the glass doors at the top of the steps. We should go inside, she lied. She gave Archer a smile. I know I was a miserable little brat when you trained at the keep, but do you want to have dinner with me tomorrow? I have the night off. You certainly had your moments back then. Archer returned her smile and sketched a brow. I'll have to move some appointments around, but I'd be delighted. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a cream-colored card engraved with his name and address. Just send word about when and where, and I'll be there. Selena had been quiet since Archer left, and Cale hadn't tried to initiate conversation with her, though he was near bursting to say something. He didn't even know where to start. During the whole exchange, all he'd really been able to think about was how much he wanted to slam Archer's pretty face against the stone building. Cale wasn't a fool. He knew some of her smiles and blushing hadn't been acted, and though he had no claim on her, though making a claim would be the stupidest thing he could ever do, the thought of her being susceptible to Archer's charms made him want to have a little chat with the courtesan. Rather than head back to the castle, she began walking through the wealthiest district in the heart of the city. Her steps unhurried. After nearly 30 minutes of silence, Cale figured he cooled his temper enough to be civil. Lena? He demanded. Slightly civil, at least. The gold streaks of her turquoise eyes were bright in the afternoon sun. Of all the things we said back there, that's what bothered you the most? It did. Word keep him, it bothered the hell out of him. When you said you knew him, I didn't realize you meant that well. He fought the strange, sudden temper that was honing itself again. Even if she'd been charmed by his looks, she was going to kill Archer. He had to remind himself. My history with Archer will allow me to get him to provide information about whatever this rebel movement is, she said, looking up at the fine houses they passed. The residential streets were tranquil, despite the bustling city center only a few blocks down. He's one of the few people who actually likes me, you know. Or he did, years ago. It shouldn't be too hard to get some inkling of what this group might be planning against the king, or who the other members might be. Part of him, he knew, should be ashamed for finding some relief from the fact that she was going to kill him. He was a better man than that, and he certainly wasn't the territorial type. And the gods knew he had no claim on her. He'd seen the look on her face when Archer had mentioned Sam. Ah! He'd heard of Sam Cortland's death in passing. He'd never known that Selena and Sam had crossed paths, but that Selena had ever loved that fiercely. On the night she was captured, she hadn't been out to collect old cold coin for a contract, No, she'd gone into that house to get revenge for the sort of loss he couldn't begin to imagine. They walked down the street, her side nearly pressed against his. He fought against the urge to lean into her, to tuck her in closer. "Cale?" she said after a few minutes. You know, I absolutely hate it when he calls me Lena, don't you?" A smile tugged at his lips, along with a flicker of relief. "So the next time I want to piss you off, don't even think about it." A smile spread, and the flicker of relief turned to something that punched him in the gut when she smiled back. Damn! I really just saw them as like a platonic relationship. I really didn't see them together. Chapter 8. She had planned to spend the rest of the day following Archer from a distance, but as they walked from the tea court, Cale informed her that the king had ordered her to assist with guard duty at a state dinner that night. And though she could think of 1,000 excuses to get out of it, any suspicious behavior on her part could draw the wrong sort of attention. If she was actually going to listen to Elena this time, she needed the king. She needed this entire empire to think she was his obedient servant. The state dinner was in the great hall, and it took all of Selena's self-control to keep from sprinting to the long table in the center of the room and horking down the food right off the plates of the gathered councilmen and preening nobility. Y'all, I can't stop thinking about what happened to Sam's body. Did they at least dispose of it properly? Like, did they at least bury my man's? I feel like with Wesley there, he probably made sure that they buried it well. Or he probably buried it himself. Because thinking about Sam being buried in an unmarked grave makes me want to slam my head through glass. Like, it wants me to break glass. Like, it makes me want to break glass with my head. I can't. If I find out that that man is buried in an unmarked grave, I don't know what I'm going to do. Roasted lamb rubed with thyme and lavender, duck glazed with orange sauce, pheasant swimming in green onion gravy. Truly, it wasn't fair. Cale had stationed her by a pillar near the glass patio doors. Though she wasn't wearing the Royal Guard's black uniform with the gold-embroidered wyvern across the chest, she blended in well enough in her dark clothes. At least she was so far away from it all that no one could hear her stomach rumbling. Other tables had been set up too, full of lesser nobility who had been invited to join, all impeccably dressed for the occasion. Most of the attention of the guards of the nobility remained on the center table where the king and queen sat with their innermost... Oh my god, I'm sorry, y'all. Innermost court. Duke Parrington, the hulking brute, also sat there, and Dorian and Roland were nearby, chatting with the precious, pampered men who made up the king's council. Men who had bled other kingdoms dry to pay for the clothes and jewels and gold in this room. Not that she was much better, in some regards. Though she tried to avoid looking at the king, every time she did steal a glance at him, she wondered why he bothered attending these events, when he could do away with this nonsense altogether. She gleaned nothing, though. And she didn't think for a moment that he'd be stupid enough to reveal anything about his true agenda in front of all these people. Cale stood at attention at the column nearest the king's chair, his eyes darting everywhere, always alert. He had his best men here tonight, all handpicked by him that afternoon. He didn't seem to realize that no one would be so suicidal as to attack the king and his court at such a public event. She tried explaining that, but Cale had just glared at her and told her not to cause trouble, as if she'd be that suicidal. The meal ended with the king standing up and bidding his guests farewell, the auburn-haired Queen Georgina dutifully and silently following him out of the great hall. The other guests remained, but now milled about from table to table, chatting with far more ease than they had while the king was present. Dorian was on his feet, Roland still beside him as they spoke to three remarkably pretty young courtiers. Roland said something that set the girls giggling and blushing behind their lace fans, and Dorian's lips stretched toward a smile. He couldn't like Roland. She had nothing more than gut feeling in Cale's story to go by, but there was something about Roland's emerald eyes that made her want to pull Dorian as far away from him as possible. Dorian was playing a dangerous game, too, she realized. As Crown Prince, he had to walk a careful line with certain people. Perhaps she'd speak to Cale about it. Selena frowned. Telling Kale would lead to tedious explanations. Maybe she just warned Dorian herself once this dinner was over. She had ended things with him romantically, but she still cared about him. Despite his history with women, he was everything that a prince should be. Intelligent, kind, charming. Why hadn't Elena approached him for the tasks? Dorian couldn't possibly know what his father was up to. No, he couldn't act the way he did if he knew that his father had such sinister intent. And maybe he shouldn't ever know. No matter what she felt for him, Dorian would rule. And maybe his father would someday reveal his power and force Dorian to make a choice about what sort of ruler he wanted to become. But she was in no hurry to have Dorian make that choice yet. When he did, she could only pray that he would be a better king than his father. Dorian knew Selena was watching him. She'd been stealing glances at him throughout the whole insufferable dinner, but she'd also been looking at Kale, and when she did, he could have sworn that her whole face changed, became softer, more contemplative. She lounged against a pillar by the patio doors, cleaning her nails with a dagger. Think the word his father had left, because he was fairly certain the king would have flayed her for it. Roland said something else to the three ladies in front of them, girls whose names Dorian had heard and immediately forgotten, and they giggled again. Roland certainly rivaled him for charm, and it seemed that Roland's mother had come with him to find the young lord a bride, a girl with land and money that would add to Mia's importance. Dorian didn't have to ask Roland to know that until his wedding night, his cousin would enjoy all of the benefits of living in the castle as a young lord. Listening to him flirt, watching him grin at these girls, Dorian didn't know whether he wanted to punch Roland or walk away. But years of living in this festering court kept Dorian from doing anything but looking gloriously bored. He glanced at Selena again, only to see her watching Kale, whose eyes were in turn fixed on Roland. Sensing Dorian's attention, Selena met his gaze. Nothing, not a hint of emotion. Dorian's temper flared, so fast that he found himself struggling for control, especially as she looked away again, and her focus returned to the captain, and stayed there. Enough. Not bothering to say goodbye to Roland or the girls, he strode out of the great hall. He had better, more important things to worry about than what Selena felt for his friend. He was the crown prince of the largest empire in the world. His entire existence was bound to the crown and the glass throne that would someday be his. She'd ended things because of that crown and throne, because she wanted a freedom he could never give her. Dorian, someone called as he entered the hallway. He didn't have to turn around to know it was Selena. She caught up to him, easily matching the brisk pace he hadn't realized he'd set. He didn't even know where he was going, only that he needed to get out of the great hall. She touched his elbow, and he hated himself for savoring the touch. Oh my god. No! What do you want? He asked. They passed beyond the busy halls, and she tugged on his arm, slowing him down. What's wrong? Why would anything be wrong? How long have you been yearning for him? Was what he really wanted to ask. Damn him for caring so much. Or for caring. Hi y'all, sorry. Okay. So I'm just gonna finish this chapter and then I have to go. I won't read chapter 9, but I have some daughter duties to attend to, so I'm gonna finish this chapter and then I have to go. Damn him for every moment he'd spent with her. You look like you could splatter someone against a wall. He raised an eyebrow. He hadn't been making a face. When you get angry, she explained, your eyes get this cold look, glazed. I'm fine. They kept walking, and she kept following him to wherever he was going. The library, he decided, turning down a passageway. He'd go to the Royal Library. If you have something to say, he drawled, putting his temper on a tight leash, then just say it. I don't trust your cousin. He paused, the shining hallway around them empty. You don't even know him. Call it instinct. Roland is harmless. Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe he has his own agenda in being here, and you're too smart to be a pawn in anyone's game, Dorian. He's from Mia. And Mia is a small, insignificant port city. It means he's got little to lose and a lot to gain. That makes people dangerous, ruthless. He'll use you, if he can. The same way an assassin from Endervere used me to become King's champion. Her lips thinned. Is that what you really think I did? I don't know what to think. He turned away. She snarled, actually snarled at him. Well, let me tell you what I think, Dorian. I think you're used to getting what you want, who you want. And just because you couldn't get who you wanted this one time... Oh. He whirled toward her. You know nothing about what I wanted. You didn't even give me the chance to tell you. She rolled her eyes. I'm not having this conversation right now. I came to warn you about your cousin, but you clearly don't care. So don't expect me to care when you find yourself nothing more than a puppet, if you aren't one already. He opened his mouth so close to exploding he could have punched the nearest wall, but Selena was already striding off. Selena stood in front of the bars to Caltaine Rompier's cell. The once beautiful lady was curled against the wall, her dress soiled and her dark hair unbound and matted. She had buried her face in her arms, but Selena could still see that her skin gleamed with sweat and had a slightly grayish hue. And the smell. She hadn't seen her since the duel, since the day Caltaine had drugged Selena's water with bloodbane so she could die at Kane's hands. Once she defeated Kane, Selena had left without witnessing the screaming fit that Caltaine had thrown. So she'd missed the moment where Caltaine had accidentally confessed to poisoning her, claiming to have been manipulated by her former beau, Duke Parrington. The Duke had denied her accusations, and Caltaine had been sent down here to await her punishment. 2 months later, it seemed that they still didn't know what to do with her, or didn't care. Hello, Caltaine, Selena said quietly. Caltaine lifted her head, her black eyes gleaming in recognition. Hello, Selena. Alright, I have to go. Sorry, y'all. If it were up to me, I wouldn't, but... The job of the oldest sibling never ends. Alright, I'll see y'all tomorrow. Actually, no, never mind. Let me not, because I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'll see y'all tomorrow, and we'll read 9 through whatever other chapters I was supposed to read tomorrow. Bye. You can read 9 alone. Okay, I'll read 9 alone. I'm sorry, y'all.